The slap echoed across the diner like a gunshot. One moment, Clara Whitmore was standing behind her counter, all 5 feet of her, looking up at a man who believed that money made him untouchable. The next moment, she was airborne, her body spinning sideways off the force of the blow, her hands reaching for the counter's edge and finding nothing. And then the floor came up and she hit it hard, the cold tile against her cheek, the taste of blood already spreading across her tongue. 50 people watched. Not one of them moved. Clara lay on the floor of the diner her husband had built with his own hands and listened to the silence of 50 people deciding that what had just happened was not their problem. She felt the blood from her split lip pooling against the white tile. She felt the gash above her left eye opening slowly, the warmth of it spreading outward like something being released. She heard Conrad Vale's breathing above her, uneven, cracked at the edges. The breathing of a man who has just done something he told himself he would never do, and has discovered that he is in fact capable of it. She did not cry. She did not beg. She put her palm flat against the tile and began with the deliberate patience of a woman who has survived more than this to push herself upright. 48 hours, Vale said. His voice had gone smooth again, the cracks sealed over the businessman restored. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced the unsigned contract, crumpled it in his fist, threw it at her face. It hit her cheek and fell open against the tile, its neat legal language lying next to the blood spreading across the floor. Sign the papers by Friday morning, or I will make sure you are buried somewhere your husband cannot find you. He straightened his tie. He fixed his hair. He walked out. The black SUV started up outside. The engines faded. And in the diner that had stood on this corner of Main Street in Copper Falls, Arizona for 45 years, 50 people sat with their coffee going cold and looked at the floor and said nothing. Jolene Pratt had been standing behind the far end of the counter. Her right hand was in her apron pocket. Her left hand was pressed against her mouth, and her whole body was shaking in the visible, thorough way of someone who has just witnessed something they cannot undo. But her right hand, the one in her pocket, was not shaking. Her right hand was holding her phone. The phone was recording. It had been recording since the moment Conrad Vale walked through the door, some instinct below conscious thought, making her press the button before she understood why. 3 minutes and 47 seconds of evidence. She did not lower the camera until the sound of the SUVs had completely faded. Then she came around the counter and knelt beside Clara, pressing a bar towel against the cut above her eye, and said her name twice softly. Clara looked up at her. I'm fine, she said. She was not fine, but she had decided she was, and with Clara Whitmore, that decision was most of the way to being true. Let's go back to the beginning, not to the morning of the slap, but further. To the morning before when the world was still the shape it had been for 45 years, and the problems it contained were the ordinary problems of an ordinary life, and a 79-year-old woman moved through the darkness of her kitchen with the confidence of someone who has made peace with every dimension of the room she inhabits. Copper Falls, Arizona, a town that had once been something and was now in the long, slow process of becoming something else, though what that something else would turn out to be was not yet clear. The copper mine had run 3 shifts for decades, had pulled men in from 2 counties and paid them wages that kept the downtown alive, that kept the theater open and the restaurants full, and the hardware store moving enough inventory to justify its existence. Then the mine had closed. Not suddenly, not all at once, but in the way that economic realities tend to arrive in small towns, quietly and then completely, one layoff notice at a time, until the notices stopped because there was no one left to send them to. The population had dropped from over 2,000 to 847. One storefront closed every month or so. The pharmacy had been gone for 6 years. The movie theater for 11. The diner on the west end of Main Street had held on for 3 years past reasonable sense before the owner finally admitted what everyone already knew and turned off his lights for the last time. But at the east end of Main Street on the corner, where the old hardware store faced the laundromat that was barely staying current on its lease, the lights of Whitmore's diner came on every morning at 5:30. They had come on every morning for 45 years. This was not an accident. This was not inertia. This was a decision made 26 years ago on the morning after Clara Whitmore buried her husband, when she came downstairs at 5:28 in the dark and put the key in the lock and turned it 3 times and pushed the door open with her right shoulder because the frame had swollen in the summer heat and required that particular angle of force, and she walked inside and turned on the lights and started the coffee. Not because she was numb, not because she didn't understand what had happened the day before, but because Frank Whitmore had built this place to be open, and while she was alive to open it, she was going to open it. That was 26 years ago. She had not missed a morning since. Clara moved through the kitchen with the efficiency of 45 years of practice. Crack the eggs 14 at a time, one-handed the yolks beaten until the mixture was uniform and pale. Fire the flat-top grill and wait for the surface shimmer that means it's ready. Lay the bacon in straight parallel lines. Start the hash browns. The movements were muscle memory, each one slotting into the next without requiring thought, which left her mind free to do what it did every morning at this hour. She went to the shelf behind the counter, moved the sugar dispenser 4 inches to the left. Behind it, tucked against the wall where only she ever looked, was a photograph. A young man 25 years old, dark hair worn longer than his grandmother had ever approved of. A grin that was half challenge and half something warmer, something that suggested the challenge was not directed at the world, but was simply the expression of someone who expected the world to be interesting. He was standing in front of a motorcycle that he had spent 6 weeks polishing to a mirror finish. His eyes, even in the photograph, had already seen more than 25 years should hold. Mason. He would be 52 now if he was still alive. That word had lived in Clara's chest for 7 years. Small, cold, stubborn. She had never spoken it aloud. She had never allowed herself to fully accept it. But it was there, patient in the way that truths you have not yet decided to face are patient. She put the sugar dispenser back. "Where are you, baby?" she said to the empty diner. The diner had no answer. It never did. She started the coffee. Dark roast, same blend Frank had ordered from the same Tucson distributor since 1978. Some rituals are not about the thing itself. They are about the act of continuation, about saying this still matters. This is still how we do things. Some part of what we built together is still here in the way we do this particular thing every morning. Jolene Pratt came in at 6:15 with her 4-year-old daughter, Daisy, asleep on her shoulder carrying the child, the way young single mothers carry sleeping children with one arm bearing the weight and the other free to pull open the door and hang up the jacket and accomplish all the other business of arriving somewhere while maintaining the careful balance of a sleeping person you love too much to wake. Jolene was 28 years old and looked 38 on the bad days. The dark circles under her eyes had stopped being something she tried to conceal. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail that she fixed twice a day without thinking about it. She had the specific exhaustion of a woman running at full capacity without any margin, the kind of tired that doesn't resolve with one good night's sleep, but requires something more structural, more foundational, a change in the underlying conditions of the life. Clara did not look up from the grill. "You're early again." "Couldn't sleep." Jolene laid Daisy on the cot in the back office, tucked a blanket around her small shoulders, kissed her forehead once, then pressed her lips against the child's hair and stayed there for a second, the way parents stay in the proximity of their sleeping children when the day has already taken something from them and the child's breathing is the only reliable comfort available. She came back out and tied on her apron. "Rent went up again," she said, not dramatically, not as a complaint seeking a response, simply as information she was carrying and needed to set down somewhere. "Third time this year. I'm 2 weeks behind already." "You'll manage," Clara said. "I don't know how much longer I can keep believing that." "One day at a time, sweetheart. That's all any of us can do." Clara had hired Jolene 5 years ago in circumstances that most reasonable employers would have considered disqualifying. 23 years old, 5 months pregnant, no local references, no family in the area, and the specific combination of pride and desperation that makes people appear simultaneously more capable and more fragile than they actually are. 6 other businesses in Copper Falls had looked at her across a desk or a counter and found reasons to say no. Clara had looked at her for approximately 4 seconds and handed her an apron. "You start tomorrow, 6 o'clock. I hope you don't mind early mornings." Jolene had stood in the doorway for a moment with the expression of someone who had braced for a refusal and did not know what to do with the absence of one. She was now the best person Clara had ever hired. She remembered every regular's order without writing it down. She came in when she was sick, not out of obligation, but out of the particular loyalty of someone who knows what it is to be given a chance when the world was mostly saying no. She looked at Daisy with a love so uncomplicated and complete that it sometimes made Clara stop in the middle of the kitchen and think about things she did not allow herself to think about most of the time. "He's not coming back." Jolene said, her voice gentle, the gentleness of someone who loves you enough to say the hard thing carefully. "It's been 7 years, Mrs. Whitmore." Clara turned the bacon, said nothing. "Then why do you still watch the road every morning, the way you look out that window before you open the blinds?" Clara looked up. Her eyes were wet, and she would have blamed the grill's steam if asked, and Jolene would have accepted that answer. Because that is what mothers do, Clara said. We watch, we hope. We refuse to accept the worst version of what might have happened even when the evidence suggests we should. She turned back to the grill. It is not rational. I have never claimed it was rational. It is simply what I do. Jolene looked at her for a moment, at this woman with the straight spine and the clear eyes and the photograph behind the sugar jar, and then she picked up her order pad and went to set the tables. Gus Dawson came in at 7:30, as he had come in every morning for 30 years. 62 years old, built solid, with the hands of a man who has spent his life in a hardware store that he actually uses rather than merely owns. He had been Frank Whitmore's closest friend. He had helped pour the foundation of this diner in the summer of 1978, both of them working in the 100-degree heat, because Frank had said he would do it himself, and Gus had said that was the most stubborn thing he had ever heard, and shown up anyway with his own tools and not mentioned it again. He had stood beside Clara at the funeral, holding her arm when her legs forgot what they were supposed to do. He slid onto his usual stool, third from the left. Clara poured his coffee before he could ask. She had been pouring it before he could ask for 3 decades. He stirred it slowly. He was not looking at her. Gus Dawson only avoided eye contact when he had something to say that he did not want to say. There was a town meeting last night, he said. Clara's hand did not stop moving, but something in her stillness changed. Conrad Vale's people were there. Phoenix Crown Development. He kept his voice low. They made what they called a final offer. Everyone on this block, everyone on Main Street sells by Friday or faces what they're calling consequences. What kind of consequences? The Kowalski family refused him last month. 2 nights later, all 4 of their vehicles had their tires slashed. Same night, nobody saw anything. Nobody came forward. That is illegal. So is half of what Conrad Vale has been doing in the county for 15 years. But he owns the sheriff, he has the mayor, and the district judge drove a car last year that none of us can explain on a county judge's salary. Gus set down his spoon. Nora, he's serious this time. My answer is what it has always been. Your answer is going to get you hurt. Clara looked at him across the counter. She had looked at difficult things before. She had looked at them in places where the consequences of getting them wrong were considerably more final than a legal dispute over property. She looked at Gus Dawson now with the same clear attention she brought to everything. Frank built this place with his hands, she said. He proposed to me beside that jukebox in 1972 with a ring from the pawn shop on 5th Street, and I said yes before he finished asking. We poured 20 years of everything we had into these walls. He died before he could see his 50th birthday, and when they buried him, I thought I would not survive it, and I did survive it, and I have come in here every single morning for 26 years because this is the last place in the world where I am completely surrounded by him. She looked at the jukebox in the corner unplugged since the night Frank died, silent all these years. I will not hand it to a developer so he can knock it down and build whatever it is he's decided this town should be instead. Not for any offer he can make. Gus shook his head slowly, the way a man shakes his head when he agrees with the principle and disagrees with the consequence. Frank would want you safe, Nora. Frank would want me to fight. Frank is gone. The words fell between them. Gus had not wanted to say them. He had said them anyway because that was what friendship required. Sometimes the willingness to say the true thing, even when the true thing caused pain. Then I will fight in his place, Clara said. And mine. Gus looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his coffee cup and drank and said nothing else, because there are people in the world whose minds cannot be changed by reasonable argument and with whom the wisest thing is to simply remain present. Clara Whitmore was one of those people. It was 9:17 when Conrad Vale walked in. He came through the door the way he entered every room, as though the room had been arranged for his arrival, and he was assessing whether the arrangement was satisfactory. 48 years old, lean in the way of a man whose maintenance is expensive and deliberate, wearing a suit that cost more than most families in Copper Falls spent on groceries in a month. A watch that caught the fluorescent light and returned it amplified. Italian leather shoes. The face of a man who has been told no infrequently enough that he has not developed a healthy relationship with the concept. 2 men followed him. Colt on his left was the size of something structural. 6'4", 250 pounds of mass that had remained useful long after his career as a prison guard had ended specifically because he had beaten an inmate with sufficient thoroughness to earn a conviction for aggravated assault. 3 years served. Vale's lawyers had managed his release, and Colt had been Vale's right hand in various capacities ever since. His face was a record of decisions made and not unmade. Dick's on his right was smaller and quieter, and considerably more frightening for both of those qualities. Nobody in Copper Falls knew his last name. Nobody had asked. The scars on his knuckles were sufficient biography. Vale scanned the room. His eyes found Clara behind the counter. He smiled. It was not a smile. It was the expression a man makes when he has decided the outcome of something and is experiencing the specific satisfaction of watching the last obstacles arrange themselves for removal. Mrs. Whitmore, his voice was smooth, practiced the voice of someone who has learned to use pleasantness as a tool. I was hoping to find you. Mr. Vale, Clara set down her coffee pot, wiped her hands on her apron, did not come out from behind the counter. My position has not changed. Positions change. He moved toward the counter with the unhurried confidence of a man who has never not gotten what he wanted for long enough to genuinely believe it might happen again. He settled onto the stool third from the left, which was Gus Dawson's stool. A fact everyone in the diner understood a fact. Vale understood a fact he had chosen precisely because he was good at identifying what belonged to other people and occupying it. Phoenix Crown Development is prepared to offer you $140,000 above current assessed market value for this property. No. Mrs. Whitmore, that is an extraordinary amount of money for... My answer is no, Mr. Vale. It was no last month, and it was no the month before that, and it is no today. Vale looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes, a calculation, a shift in approach. He leaned forward slightly, dropping the volume of his voice in a way that was simultaneously more intimate and more threatening. You're a widow, he said. No siblings, no children in regular contact. He paused, watching her face. One son, Mason Whitmore. Went by Reaper, I'm told, in certain circles. Hell's Angel. Prominent in the Southwest chapter until 7 years ago, when he was involved in an incident on a highway outside Phoenix and a 22-year-old boy died. Another pause. He was watching her the way hunters watch things for the specific movement that confirms the shot will land. Your son let that boy bleed out on the pavement. Then he disappeared. No apology to the family. No appearance at the funeral. 7 years of absolute silence. He sat back slightly. You've been waiting for him, haven't you? Every night that light above the door. Clara's hands had gone still on the counter. She looked at Conrad Vale, and something she had been managing carefully for a long time rose in her chest, and she let it. My son made mistakes, she said. Her voice was very quiet and very complete, the voice of a woman who has thought about the thing she is saying for a long time and has arrived at the final version of it. He is carrying things that would have destroyed most men. He is carrying them in the way that I raised him to carry hard things, which is to carry them rather than put them down on someone else. And he is more of a man in his worst moment than you are in your best. Vale's eye twitched. What did you say? You heard what I said. The slap came before anyone in the room could register that he had moved. Clara hit the counter's edge as she fell a crack that was distinct and terrible, and she went down to the floor. Blood from her split lip, the gash above her left eye opening, the cold tile against her face. 50 people held their breath. Vale stood over her. His composure was cracked, the smooth surface of him showing the fault line beneath, and he breathed in and out twice before he reassembled it, before he became the businessman again. 48 hours, he said. He threw the crumpled contract at her. Sign by Friday morning, or I will bury you where your husband cannot find you. He adjusted his cuffs. And if that son of yours ever finds his way back to this town, tell him what I did to you today. Tell him it is nothing compared to what I will do to him. He walked out. The diner was silent. Jolene came from behind the counter and knelt beside Clara before the sound of the SUVs had faded from the street. Clara was already trying to get up. Jolene helped her, one hand on her arm, the other pressing a clean bar towel against the cut above her eye. Around them, 50 people sat in their booths and at their stools and continued to look at the things in front of them that were not Clara Whitmore. We have to call the police, Jolene said. No, Clara's voice was strained but controlled. The police work for him. You know that. Then someone, there has to be. There isn't. Clara looked at the faces in the diner, at the people of the town she had served for 45 years, and she did not say what she saw in their faces because saying it would have required her to be unkind to people she understood. Fear is not a character flaw. Fear is a response to real danger. And Conrad Vale had spent 15 years in this county making himself into a danger that was very real. She reached up and straightened her apron. "Help me up properly," she said. "I have a lunch service to run." Jolene helped her up. Clara stood at the counter with blood dried at the corner of her mouth and a cut held closed by a damp bar towel, and her spine did what it had always done, which was hold her upright. That evening, after the diner was closed and cleaned, and Clara was settled in the apartment upstairs with strict instructions about rest that she had no intention of following, Jolene sat in her car in the parking lot behind the diner, with Daisy asleep in the back seat. She looked at her phone. The video was 3 minutes and 47 seconds of clear, unambiguous evidence. Vale's voice, the slap, Clara's body hitting the floor, the contract thrown at her face. All of it. It was also, if sent to the right number, something else entirely. She had spent 3 months finding that number. A contact of someone in the Desert Southwest biker network who had heard that Mason Whitmore, formerly known as Reaper, had last been seen in the Barstow area. A phone number that might be current or might be dead, that might reach the man she needed or might reach no one. Clara had told her not to. Had said in Clara's way, which was not pleading, but was the closest she got, "Mason went away for reasons, Jolene. He had reasons. Dragging him back will only cause more pain for both of us." Jolene looked at the back door of the diner. At the light above the front entrance, visible from here, burning in the dark the way it burned every night, the light Clara turned on every evening and left on all night in case. Just in case. Because for 7 years, a 79-year-old woman had maintained the possibility of her son's return through the simple, faithful act of leaving a light on in the window. Jolene opened a text message, entered the number, typed 3 words. "They hurt your mother." She attached the video. Her thumb hovered over send. She thought about 5 years ago, 23 years old and 5 months pregnant, standing in the rain on the sidewalk outside this diner, having been turned away from 6 other doors in the same afternoon. She had knocked on this one without much hope, and the door had opened, and a woman had looked at her for 4 seconds and said, "You start tomorrow," and meant it. "Some debts cannot be settled with money." She pressed send. She sat in the dark for a moment, listening to Daisy breathe. "I hope you're out there," she said to the darkness, to a number she wasn't sure was still in service. "I hope you're the man she thinks you are." 200 miles to the west, in a motel room in Barstow, California, a phone buzzed on a bathroom floor. Mason Whitmore was sitting with his back against the cold porcelain of the tub. His boots were still on because taking your boots off means committing to the night, and Mason had not been making that kind of commitment. A bottle of bottom-shelf whiskey rested against his thigh. His hands were scarred and heavy on his knees, the hands of a man who had done difficult things and had not stopped feeling them. He had not been sleeping. He had not been sleeping in any meaningful way for 7 years, which was how long he had been in the gray country between living and the alternative, sustaining himself on whiskey and motion, and the particular numbness that comes from choosing highways that lead nowhere as a method of not thinking about where you should actually be. The phone buzzed. He did not look at it. It buzzed again. He pressed play. He watched it once, then again. By the third viewing, his hands were shaking and the whiskey bottle had rolled away across the tile, and he had not noticed. By the 5th viewing, something had broken open inside him, broken the way old dams break, not gradually but all at once, with the particular violence of a structure that has been under pressure for too long. He pressed stop. He pressed his palms flat against the cold tile. He breathed. Then he stood up and put his fist through the drywall, once, twice, 3 times, until this plaster dust settled in the air and his knuckles bled, and the pain in his hands gave him something physical to hold on to, something present, something that existed outside the image of his mother on a tile floor with blood on her face. He went outside. The Mojave at 4 in the morning, the mineral smell of desert rock and distance, the sky full of stars that have no opinion about the things happening beneath them. He pulled the tarp off the Harley, 3 years since he had touched it. The paint was intact. The chrome was waiting. The Hells Angels patch on the saddlebag was exactly where he had left it. He ran his hand along the gas tank and thought about all the reasons he had told himself he did not deserve to sit on this bike anymore. All the reasons he had constructed for the years of motels and whiskey, and he compared those reasons to the image of his mother on the floor, and the comparison was not complicated. He pulled out a second phone. An older phone kept charged for 7 years without being used, with 3 numbers stored in it and no names. He called the first one. 3 rings, a voice rough and wide awake. "Who the hell is this?" "Ironside," Mason said. "It's Reaper." 10 seconds of silence. 7 years, the voice said. "Not one word. We thought you were dead. Someone hurt my mother." The silence this time was a different quality entirely. colder, more focused. Where are you? Barstow. We'll be there by noon. Route 66 east end of town. A pause. Wow. This is not forgiveness, Mason. This is family. And nobody touches family. Not even family that ran. The line went dead. Mason stood in the parking lot with the phone in his hand and looked at the Harley. 3 years. He had told himself he did not deserve the win, did not deserve the road, did not deserve to feel anything good. He had believed this in the way you believe things when believing them protects you from a more frightening truth. But his mother was bleeding. He threw his leg over the seat, turned the key. The engine caught on the first try, and the sound that came out of it was deep and physical and completely alive, filling the Mojave darkness with something that had been silent for too long. He pulled onto Route 66 heading east and opened the throttle and rode toward the horizon where the first gray suggestion of dawn was beginning to separate the earth from the sky. He met them at the eastern edge of Copper Falls at noon. 93 motorcycles staged along Route 66, 2 columns facing west, waiting. Black leather, chrome, the Hells Angels patches visible from a quarter mile. The riders standing beside their bikes or sitting on them with the particular stillness of people who have somewhere to be and are simply waiting for the signal to get there. Mason pulled up to the lead bike. Colonel Rex Carver climbed off it, 62 years old. 6 feet 2, 220 pounds, none of it soft. Silver hair and a military cut that had survived everything else. A scar from his left temple to his jaw from an IED outside Fallujah in 2004 that he did not discuss. The Purple Heart on his vest. The 101st Airborne patch. The eyes of a man who has done serious things in serious places and has made peace with most of them. They looked at each other across 10 feet of Arizona asphalt with 7 years between them. "You look terrible," Ironside said. "Yeah. You've been riding since when?" "4 this morning." A pause. Ironside's jaw moved slightly, a gesture that on another face would have been visible emotion. On his face, it meant something more than most people's tears. "You called," he said. "I called." Ironside turned back to the formation and made a gesture short and precise, and 93 engines started simultaneously, a wall of sound that was physical, that lived in the chest, in the back teeth, in the soles of the feet. Every rider swung up. The formation began to move. Mason got back on his Harley and rode to the front. He had not planned to. The column simply made space for him, bike by bike, without instruction, and he moved through it and emerged at the head and rode. Down Route 66 into Copper Falls onto Main Street. The sound shook windows in their frames. People came out of every open business and stood on the sidewalk. Gus Dawson came out of the hardware store and let his coffee cup fall without noticing it break. 93 motorcycles in perfect formation rolled down Main Street and stopped in front of Whitmore's diner, and the engines cut simultaneously, and the silence that followed was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something decided. Inside the diner, Clara Whitmore was wiping down tables. Her left eye was swollen shut. The gash above her eyebrow was held together with butterfly bandages from Jolene's first aid kit. Her lip was split and dark at the corner. Every movement sent pain through her ribs where she had hit the counter's edge. She was doing the work anyway because stopping meant thinking and thinking meant feeling the full weight of what had happened, and she wasn't ready for that yet. She was still in the part of the aftermath where forward motion substitutes for processing. She heard the engines. She knew. Not consciously, deeper than consciousness, in the part of her that had spent 7 years listening for a particular sound on an empty road. The barcloth fell from her hand. She walked to the front door and pushed it open and stepped into the morning sun. 93 motorcycles. 93 men in black leather standing in the street outside her diner. And at the center of the formation, standing 20 feet from her door, a 52-year-old man with gray in his beard and lines around his eyes, and the posture of someone who has walked through fire so many times he has stopped being surprised by heat. Clara walked toward him. The bikers parted without a word, creating a lane, and she walked through it in her slippers and her bathrobe, with the dignity of a woman who has never in her life adjusted her direction for another person's comfort. She stopped in front of her son. They looked at each other. 7 years, all of it in 3 seconds. The accumulated weight of every unreturned call, every letter sent to uncertain addresses, every night she had left the light on and waited and told herself tomorrow. Maybe tomorrow. Clara raised her hand and slapped her son across the face. The sound cut across Main Street like something final. 93 bikers went dead silent. Mason did not move, did not raise his hand to his cheek, did not step back. He stood and received it completely as a man receives something he has been carrying the knowledge of for 7 years. 7 years. Clara's voice shook with the specific tremor of something held under pressure for a very long time finally releasing. Not one word, Mason, not one call, not one letter. I prayed over your photograph every night. I wrote to addresses I wasn't sure existed. I left messages on numbers I didn't know were current. I thought you were dead, and then I thought you were alive, and had decided I wasn't worth the effort of a single word, and I could not determine which of those was worse. I'm sorry, Ma. She hit his chest with both palms. He let her. The hits grew weaker until they were not hits at all, but simply her hands resting against his jacket, feeling the heartbeat beneath it. Real. Warm. Here. Her hands closed around his lapels. I begged God to bring you home, she whispered, every morning before I opened that door. Every night before I turned off the light. Every single day for 7 years I asked him, and I never stopped asking, even when everything said I should. Mason put his arms around his mother. He held her. 93 men stood in the Arizona sun and were quiet because some things do not need commentary to be understood. They sat in the back booth, Frank's booth, the one with the angle that showed the whole room. Colonel Rex Carver sat across from Clara with both hands around a coffee cup that Jolene had filled and refilled twice. Daisy had climbed into Mason's lap without asking, with the absolute confidence of a 4-year-old who has assessed the situation and decided she belongs there, and was examining one of his rings with intense professional interest. Gus Dawson had come in from across the street and was sitting at the counter listening. Mrs. Whitmore, Ironside said, before anything else, I need you to understand who we are. Because I know what this town sees when it looks at us, and you deserve the truth. Then tell me the truth, Clara said. We are Lily's Legacy Foundation, 501c3 nonprofit registered in Nevada, operating in 22 states for 20 years. He set down his coffee. We are veterans. Most of us served in places that changed us in ways we are still accounting for. And we came home and did what men do when they come home, which is try to figure out what to do next with everything they've become. He paused. I had a daughter, he said. Lily, 7 years old, blonde hair, the kind of laugh that carries through walls and you don't mind hearing it at all. She got sick. Leukemia, the aggressive kind. His voice was level. The levelness was the product of long practice, of having told this story enough times to have built the structure that holds it. The insurance company found a clause. Pre-existing condition, language written specifically to be found only when someone needs to find it. They denied coverage. The treatment cost $200,000. The diner was very quiet. I was special forces. Good pay. Should have been sufficient. I sold everything. House vehicles called every favor owed to me across 20 years of service. I got to $160,000. I was $40,000 short. He looked at his hands. Lily died in my arms in a hospital room. Her last words were a question and a promise. She asked me why I couldn't make the hurt stop. And she made me promise to help other kids, to not let this happen to anyone else if I could stop it. He reached inside his vest and placed a small photograph on the table. A little girl in a hospital bed, bald from chemotherapy, smiling with the unguarded openness of a child who has not yet learned to hide her feelings from the camera. That was 20 years ago, Ironside said. Lily's Legacy Foundation has since helped 3,047 families. We have paid $12 million in medical bills. We have prevented 187 home foreclosures. We have housed and employed 423 veterans who came home to nothing. We have sent 89 young people to college who had no other way to get there. He produced a folder. IRS letters, financial statements, news coverage from across the Southwest. All of it real, all of it documented, all of it verifiable. We are not what this town thinks we are. Clara looked at the folder. She did not open it yet. Why are you here? She asked. For me specifically. Ironside reached into his jacket again. He placed a different photograph on the table. Older, faded, the colors muted by years and handling. Clara looked at it and stopped breathing. She was 23 years old in the photograph. Desert camouflage sleeves rolled up dust on her face and arms. Standing beside a military vehicle in a desert that was not Arizona. Even in the faded photograph, the posture was recognizable. That particular straightness. March 2004, Ironside said. Fallujah, Iraq, 1st Medical Battalion. Clara's hands had gone still on the table. Staff Sergeant Marcus Pratt, Ironside continued. 3 rounds in less than 30 seconds. 2 torso, 1 shoulder. He was down and he had maybe 20 minutes if nobody acted, and his unit was pinned down and nobody could move. He looked at her steadily. Except you moved. The diner was silent except for the ancient air conditioning. You went into open ground under fire. You took a round in your left shoulder. You kept moving. You reached Marcus Pratt and you kept him alive for 40 minutes until the evacuation helicopter arrived. You refused morphine for yourself because you said you needed your mind clear in case he arrested. Ironside held her gaze. You saved his life. Clara pressed her lips together. Marcus, she said. The name was private and careful. The name of someone she had thought about over 20 years, in the way you think about the people you have held on to in the worst moments. How is he? He passed 2 years ago, lung cancer. Ironside's voice was careful. He had 20 additional years that he would not have had without you. He saw his daughter grow up. He walked her through everything that mattered. He held his granddaughter. He paused. He talked about you until the end. He called you the angel who ran toward the fire. He tried to find you for years. You had gotten married, changed your name, moved here. He never stopped looking. Clara's eyes were wet. His daughter, she said. Jolene Pratt had been standing at the edge of the table for the past several minutes holding a coffee pot she had forgotten to use. She was crying in the quiet, thorough way of someone caught completely off guard by something they had no defense against. The coffee pot was trembling. Her face was completely open. His daughter, Ironside said gently, looking at Jolene, has been working in your diner for 5 years. Clara turned. She looked at Jolene Bondon. She looked at her with the attention of someone reorganizing everything they thought they understood about a face they have looked at every day for years, finding the layer beneath the familiar surface, the layer that had been there all along. Jolene set the coffee pot down before she dropped it. She pressed both hands to her face. Her shoulders shook. My dad talked about you my whole life, she said. The words came apart and she assembled them anyway. The woman who ran the wrong direction. He said she was the bravest person he ever saw, and he'd been in the army for 15 years. He said if he ever found her, he was going to tell her she gave him 20 more years, that she gave me a father. She lowered her hands. Her face was wet, and she made no attempt to be otherwise. He died before he found you. Daisy climbed off Mason's lap. She walked around the booth and wrapped her arms around Jolene's legs and pressed her face against her mother's hip, which was what she always did when her mother cried an instinct so pure and immediate it needed no instruction. Clara stood up from the booth. She crossed the small distance and put her arms around Jolene and held her, this young woman whose father she had held together in the dirt of Fallujah 20 years ago, held her the way she held the things that mattered completely, without condition. Marcus was one of the best, she said into Jolene's hair. I am so glad he came home. The police arrived 20 minutes later. 6 county vehicles, 2 state police cruisers, staged along Main Street with the deliberate theatricality of authority trying to establish itself through volume rather than legitimacy. Sheriff Warren Holt stepped out of the lead vehicle. 55 years old, 20 extra pounds, he had stopped fighting a decade ago, his hand resting on his service weapon, in the reflexive way of a man who leans on the suggestion of force when he is uncertain about the conversation. He looked at 93 bikers arranged across Main Street and squared his shoulders. This is Sheriff Warren Holt. You are in violation of Ordinance 14B regarding unlawful assembly. I am ordering you to disperse immediately. Ironside stepped out of the diner. His hands were visible at his sides. His voice carried further than Holt's without being raised. Sheriff, we're visiting a friend and having coffee. I'd like to know which ordinance that violates. You're Hell's Angels, known criminal organization. We're Lily's Legacy Foundation, 501c3 fully registered. I have the IRS determination letter in my vest if you'd like to review it. A pause. I'd also like to know why Conrad Vale, who assaulted Mrs. Whitmore in her own diner in front of 50 witnesses yesterday morning, has not been arrested. I have the video. I've already sent copies to the FBI field office in Phoenix, the state attorney general, and 3 television stations. Holt's face went red. The walking stick struck asphalt from within the crowd. Edna Holt was 80 years old, bald, white hair pulled back without compromise. A house dress and practical shoes and a walking stick she used not for balance, but because she had discovered it gives you something to point with and the authority of someone who no longer cares what anyone thinks. She moved through the crowd the way water moves through a narrow space, not aggressively, but inevitably, and planted herself between her son and the bikers. Warren Joseph Holt. The sheriff went pale. There are tones that belong only to mothers, tones that carry within them the complete history of every expectation ever held and every disappointment ever witnessed. Edna Holt had one of these tones, and she deployed it now with the precision of someone who has been saving it for exactly this moment. Mom, this is official police. Don't you mom me while you're pointing yourself at these men like they're the problem. She turned to face the crowd on the sidewalk. How many of you were in that diner yesterday morning? How many of you watched Clara Whitmore get knocked to the ground? She looked from face to face. How many of you called the police? Silence. Shoes became very interesting. The middle distance had never been more carefully examined. Your father wore that badge for 30 years, Warren. Do you know why he kept wearing it? She looked at the Purple Heart on Ironside's vest, at the combat patches, at the men who had come here from wherever they had been when the call came. These people came here because a woman who has fed this town for 45 years was hurt and no one did anything. Your father would be ashamed of what you have allowed this town to become. She looked at her son, and so am I. Holt stood in the street, 20 years of small decisions stacked in his mind at once. Every favor extended, every report quietly modified every time he had looked the other way, because the alternative required more courage than he had found available. He looked at Clara in the diner doorway with the bruising on her face. He looked at Ironside's Purple Heart. He looked at his mother, 80 years old and standing in the street in her house dress because she had decided what needed to be done. He turned to his deputies. Stand down. His voice was flat, emptied. These men are not breaking any law. Return to your vehicles. He walked back to his cruiser, got in, closed the door. He did not start the engine for several minutes. He sat with his face in his hands and his shoulders shaking, and if anyone had been watching closely, they would not have needed to ask why. That night, long after the diner had closed and Jolene had taken Daisy upstairs and the last of the bikers had settled into their various accommodations, Clara sat alone in the back booth with a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. She was thinking about Frank, about the summer he had poured this foundation, about the morning he proposed, how young they had been, how certain, how full of the specific audacity of people who have decided that love is sufficient to build on. She was thinking about 26 years of mornings alone, about Mason's face today on Main Street, older, harder, broken, in ways that sleep hadn't reached, but here, present, real. She was also thinking about her diagnosis. 3 months ago, an oncologist in Flagstaff had shown her scans and used words she had expected and had not been fully prepared for regardless. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, 6 months, possibly less. Treatment options that she had listened to carefully and then declined because she was 79 years old, and she had already decided that whatever time remained to her would not be spent in a hospital room fighting a battle. The numbers did not favor at the cost of the only months that were guaranteed. She had told no one. She had come back to Copper Falls and opened the diner the following morning and made the coffee and continued. Mason came in from the street and sat down across from her. She looked at him. How long are you staying? She asked. As long as you need. She looked at her coffee cup. There is something you need to know, she said, before someone else tells you or before you figure it out on your own. She looked up. When did you last ask me if I'd seen a doctor? Mason went still. How long have you known? He said. 3 months. What is it? Pancreatic cancer, she said. Stage 4, 6 months, perhaps less. She said it the way she said everything difficult, plainly, without adornment, because the plain truth is kinder than the softened one in the long run. Mason put his elbows on the table and his face in his hands. Mom, I am 79 years old, she said. I have had a full life, a life I am proud of in which I have been loved well and have tried to love well in return. The treatment they offered would make me sick. It might buy weeks. And I have decided that I would rather spend 6 months here in this diner with the people I love drinking this coffee and watching the sun come up over the desert than spend 2 months in a hospital room trying to negotiate with something that has already decided. There are specialists, second opinions, clinical trials. No, gently, completely. This is not a decision I am asking your permission for. I am telling you what is happening because you are my son and you deserve to know. She reached across the table and put her hand on his. I am not asking you to fix it. I am asking you to stay. Mason raised his face from his hands. His eyes were red. His jaw was tight with the effort of holding himself together, an effort that was failing slowly and inevitably. Stay, he said. That is the only thing I want from you. Everything else I can face if you are here. She held his hand. I left that light on every night for 7 years, Mason. I want you to know that I know you know that. And I want you to know that I understand whatever it was that kept you away, whatever you've been carrying. I'm not asking you to explain it or justify it or make it make sense. She looked at her son, this broken present, real man who was her greatest achievement and her greatest sorrow and the thing she loved most in the world. You are here now. That is what counts. Mason held her hand. The night moved around them. The desert outside was vast and patient and full of stars, and the diner was warm and smelled of coffee and 45 years of mornings. And Clara Whitmore sat in Frank's booth with her son across from her and felt for the first time in a very long time something that was not quite peace, but was close enough to it to be worth sitting with. There is a particular quality to the Arizona desert in the hours before dawn, a silence that is not absence but presence, a quality of attention the landscape gives to the things happening within it. The rocks hold the heat of the previous day and release it slowly. The nighthawks call across the distances between things. The stars are dense and indifferent and magnificent in the way that things are magnificent when they exist on a scale that makes human grief seem appropriately sized. At 3 in the morning, glass shattered behind Whitmore's diner. Clara heard it from the apartment above. She had not been sleeping. She had been lying in the dark, aware of Mason in the next room, aware of Jolene and Daisy down the hall, aware of 93 men distributed across the sleeping town who had come because someone asked and who would stay until the thing was finished. She heard the glass break and knew. By the time she reached the back stairs, Mason was already below her, moving through the kitchen in the dark, with the automatic precision of someone whose body retains the training his mind has tried to forget. She followed him out the back door. The storage shed was burning. Frank Whitmore had built it in 1981 from salvaged lumber, and it had stood for 43 years in the alley behind the diner, holding the accumulated tools of a working life. The drawers and levels and chisels and handsaws. The old wooden toolbox that had belonged to Frank's father with HW carved in the inside lid by a penknife in 1942. The mesquite rocking chair Frank had spent an entire winter making for their 10th anniversary, finishing it with 3 coats of linseed oil applied 2 weeks apart, presenting it to her on a Sunday morning before the diner opened while she cried and he pretended not to notice. The chair was in the shed. Ironside materialized from the shadows of the alley with 3 others, the way men with his background always appear without announcing themselves, already present when you notice them. They assessed the fire with the efficient attention of people trained to assess things quickly. The shed was already fully engaged. Nothing inside it was recoverable. Ma, Mason's hand on her arm. Come back inside, it's not safe. No, she moved his hand. She walked toward the burning shed until the heat pushed back against her, until she was close enough to feel it in her face and smell the specific smell of old wood consuming itself. She stopped there and she watched. Clara, Jolene had come down, was standing behind her with her arms wrapped around herself. Clara, please. It's all right, Clara said. They stood in the alley and watched the shed burn. Mason stood beside his mother and did not touch her because she did not want to be touched, because what she needed in that moment was to witness this directly, without insulation, without protection. I can replace the tools, Mason said. Everything in there. I'll take care of it. Things can be replaced. Her voice was quiet and complete. People cannot. Memories cannot. She watched a section of roof collapse inward, watched sparks rise in a column into the dark sky. Frank is not in that shed, Mason. He never was. He is in these walls. He is in the foundation he poured himself. He is in every cup of coffee I have made in that kitchen for 45 years because I make it the way he taught me, and I will make it that way until I cannot anymore. She looked at her son. The love does not live in objects. It lives in us, in the choices we make when everything is burning down. Ironside and his men had already disappeared from the alley. Neither Clara nor Mason noticed them go. Conrad Vale had spent the night on the phone with lawyers who told him what he needed to hear. He had been told the legal situation was manageable. He had been told the video evidence could be challenged. He had been told that his position in the county was sufficiently established that a single incident, regardless of documentation, would not produce the consequences he was worried about. He had not been told about what Ironside's men were doing in Phoenix. He had not been told about this because the only person who should have told him had accepted a cup of coffee from a man wearing a Purple Heart and 3 combat patches from the 101st Airborne, and had made the pragmatic assessment that his salary did not cover this specific situation, and had spent 20 minutes in the stairwell looking at his phone while 5 veterans moved through the offices above him. 15 years of files, bribery records, forged environmental reports, wire transfers to offshore accounts, Correspondence describing in remarkably direct language the methods used against property owners who refused to cooperate. Payments to a county judge, a state senator, 2 city council members, and a sheriff. All of it photographed. All of it transmitted by 6 in the morning to the FBI field office in Phoenix, the state attorney general, the Arizona Republic reporter who had been working on the Phoenix Crown story for 2 years and 2 television stations. Vale arrived in Copper Falls at 6:15 with 12 black SUVs and 53 hired men and the complete confidence of a person who does not yet know that the ground beneath him has already shifted. He stepped out of the lead vehicle. He saw the 93 motorcycles. He saw the people standing in front of the diner in the hardware store. He saw the quality of stillness in the men who watched his vehicles arrive, the stillness of people who are not afraid of what they are looking at, and he filed this observation under the category of things he would deal with through force because force had always been sufficient before. Last chance, he said in the middle of Main Street in the early morning light. His voice was steady. He had prepared to be steady. Phoenix Crown Development has made its final offer. Everyone on this block signs today. The Whitmore property by noon. Or I pursue every available option. Ironside came out of the diner and walked to the center of the street and stopped 20 feet from Vale with his hands in his pockets. No, he said. Vale looked at him for a moment. Then he turned to his men and gave the signal. 53 men charged. 93 veterans met them. The confrontation lasted 11 minutes. It was not cinematic. It did not have the choreographed quality of imagined violence. It was efficient and physical and brief in the way that genuine confrontations between people who know what they are doing and people who only think they do are always brief. Vale's men were large and accustomed to being frightening. Ironside's men had served in Fallujah and Kandahar and places that do not appear in comfortable conversations about conflict. They did not waste movement. They did not perform. They applied the precise minimum of force necessary to each situation and moved to the next one. At the end of 11 minutes, Vale's hired men were in various states of retreat, some walking, some not, heading toward vehicles with the specific purpose of people who have reassessed their employment situation and found it wanting. Vale stood alone in the street. He did not run. This was perhaps the only genuine thing he had done in years, this refusal to run, this choice to remain in the place where things had gone wrong and face whatever came next. It was not courage in any meaningful sense. It was more like the paralysis of a man whose entire model of the world has been disproven in 11 minutes and who does not yet know how to exist without it. He looked at the diner. He walked toward it. Clara was sitting in the back booth. She had been there since 4 in the morning. She had come downstairs after the shed burned and found that the apartment held nothing for her, that the diner was where she needed to be. She had made coffee and wiped down tables that did not need wiping and stood at the east window watching for the change in the dark. That means dawn is approaching. When she heard the vehicles arrive, she did not go to the window. When the sounds of the confrontation on Main Street reached her, she listened until they ended. Then she sat down in the back booth, in Frank's booth, and she folded her hands on the table and she waited. She had known he was coming. Not in any mystical sense, simply in the sense that she had lived long enough and paid enough attention to understand how men like Conrad Vale work, how their particular kind of pride functions, how it requires one final passage through the place where it was defeated before it can accept defeat. Vale came through the front door. He moved through the dim diner. The fluorescents were not yet on. The only light was the morning coming through the east window, and it caught the edges of things and left the centers in shadow. His breathing was uneven. His face had lost the smooth management it usually wore and showed instead the thing beneath it, which was a frightened man doing what frightened men do when they cannot figure out where else to go. He had a gun. He held it at his side, not yet pointed at anything, the gesture of a man who picked it up in a decisive moment and has not yet decided what the decision was for. He found her in the back booth. She was sitting with her hands folded on the table, looking at him directly with the same expression she had worn every time he came into this diner. Not afraid, not defiant, simply present, completely present in the way that people are present who have made their peace with wherever they are. "Sit down, Richard," she said. He blinked. "I beg your pardon. You have been driving since before dawn. You have been on your phone all night with lawyers who told you what you needed to hear rather than what was true. You are standing in a diner at 6 in the morning holding a gun, and you have not yet decided what you came here to accomplish." She nodded at the seat across from her. "Sit down." He looked at the seat. He looked at the gun, He looked at the 79-year-old woman who was looking at him the way a person looks at a problem they believe is solvable with sufficient patience. He sat down. He set the gun on the table between them, not pointed at her, not pointed away, simply present a fact among other facts. You should have sold, he said. His voice had changed, the practiced smoothness gone, what remained rawer and more honest than anything she had heard from him. I made you a fair offer. I made you multiple fair offers. All of this could have been avoided. No, Clara said. It could not have been. Because this was never about the money. Everything is about money. Nothing is about money. Money is what people use when they cannot find the real thing they are looking for. She held his gaze. What are you looking for, Richard? He looked at his hands. I built a company, he said, from nothing. I built something that employs 1,200 people, that has developed properties in 6 states, that has my name on buildings across the Southwest. He stopped. My wife left 8 years ago. My son doesn't return my calls. The people I spend my time with are people I pay or people who want something from me. He looked up. I am in every room the most successful person there, and there is not one person in the world who would be genuinely sad if I disappeared tomorrow. The morning light moved across the table between them. You wanted to matter, Clara said. It was not a judgment. It was simple recognition, the identification of a true thing in the plain language it deserves. You wanted people to look at you and see someone important, someone whose existence meant something, someone who could not be ignored. Yes, the word came out stripped of all its defenses, and you chose the wrong tools for that goal. Her voice was gentle, with the specific gentleness of someone who has decided to tell the truth kindly. You cannot take mattering from people, Richard. You cannot buy it or frighten anyone into giving it to you. Genuine respect is not something produced by fear. It is something that happens when you give something real, when you build something that helps rather than takes, when you stay when leaving is easier and tell the truth when lying is safer. She unfolded her hands and placed one on the table near his. Not touching. Offered. You spent 20 years using the wrong tools and then being surprised that you kept ending up alone. Vale's eyes were wet. He had not planned for this. He had planned for nothing that had happened in this room or in this town. He had a model of reality, and it had been failing him continuously since the moment he had looked at this woman on the floor of her diner and seen, instead of submission, something that looked disturbingly like pity. I'm sorry, he said. The words arrived without architecture, without the careful scaffolding he usually built around vulnerable things. I know, Clara said. I don't expect you to, I know you don't. She looked at him steadily. I am going to tell you something, Richard, and I want you to hear it clearly and completely. I forgive you. She held up one hand at his expression. Not because you have earned it, not because what you did to me was acceptable, or because the consequences you are about to face are not yours to face, but because I am 79 years old, and I have perhaps 6 months left to live, and I will not spend a single minute of those months carrying hatred for anyone. She held his gaze. That forgiveness is not a gift to you, it is a gift to myself. I am giving it because I refuse to die weighted down by anger at a man who simply chose the wrong path. The front door of the diner opened, not violently, steadily, with the measured pace of authority that has made its decision. Sheriff Warren Holt came through first. He walked differently than he had been walking for 20 years. The walk of a man who has spent a night arriving at something and has come out the other side, changed in a way that is not reversible. 2 FBI agents in federal identification followed him, 3 state police officers. Mr. Vale, Holt said, his voice was level, I'm placing you under arrest. Vale looked at Holt. He looked at Clara. He looked at the gun on the table between them, which he had not fired and would not fire, which he had perhaps never actually intended to fire, which had been more a prop of desperation than a genuine threat. He turned it handle first toward the nearest officer. He stood. He placed his wrists together. At the door, he paused and turned back. Your son, he said, when I said those things about him, at the end. He's here, Clara said. He came home. Vale nodded slowly, as if this information was completing something for him, confirming some final piece of a picture he had been trying to assemble. Good, he said. Then he was gone. Mason came through the door 30 seconds later, moving fast. Ironside a step behind, and he crossed the diner and had his arms around his mother before either of them spoke. Clara held on. She felt his heartbeat in the solidity of his chest, and she closed her eyes. He dropped the gun, she said into his jacket. I know. I was watching from the window. She pulled back to look at him. You were there the whole time and you let me handle it. You had it handled. She studied his face. This broken present, complicated man. Her son. She laughed. It was small and real and genuine, the laugh of a woman who has been through the hardest thing and has come out the other side with her essential self intact. Yes, she said. I suppose I did. Ironside returned to the diner that afternoon with 3 envelopes. He came alone. He sat down across from Clara and Mason in the back booth and placed the envelopes on the table between them, and he did not explain them immediately, which was the gesture of a man who understands that some gifts need a moment of silence before they can be received properly. Clara looked at the envelopes. She did not reach for them. What are these? She said. The Foundation's board voted last night, unanimously. He pushed the first one toward her. Clara opened it slowly. She looked at the check inside. Her hand went to her mouth. That is for your medical expenses, Ironside said. Everything from this point forward, every treatment option you choose to pursue, every medication, every appointment, every conversation with a specialist at any institution you want to consult. No insurance company deciding what you deserve. No forms to fight with while you are trying to use your strength for something more important. He looked at her directly. You do not argue with Lily's Legacy Foundation about this, Mrs. Whitmore. We do not accept arguments. We simply write checks. This is too much. I cannot. You ran into open fire in Fallujah and took 3 rounds to keep Marcus Pratt alive. You gave Jolene her father. You gave that little girl upstairs her grandfather. You gave me back my brother. His voice remained even. There is not a number on that check that begins to reflect what you gave. This is not generosity. It is an extremely small payment on a debt that cannot be settled. Clara pressed her lips together. She was quiet for a moment. He slid the second envelope across. Mason opened it. Inside was a letter on Foundation stationery. Manager of Community Programs, Lily's Legacy Foundation, he read. He looked up. $52,000 annually, Ironside said. Full benefits. Real health insurance. You would work from Copper Falls building the local program. You would choose who receives help. You would design the intake process. You would hire the people who will run it. He paused. After. Clara looked at the letter. Because you've been paying everyone else's bills for 45 years and nobody has paid yours, Ironside said. Because work is not only money, it is purpose, and I think you understand that better than almost anyone. The third, Clara said. He slid the last envelope across. She opened it herself. Inside was a single document. The deed to Whitmore's diner. Her name. At the bottom, a stamped notation in red: mortgage satisfied in full. Date of payoff today. You own it completely, Ironside said. No outstanding balance, no bank with any claim on this building, no one who can use financial leverage to threaten what you have built. He held her gaze. It is yours, the way it should always have been. Clara set the deed on the table. She smoothed the front of her apron. She looked at the deed and the check and the letter. She looked at this man who had driven through the desert with 93 veterans because someone had been hurt, because that was what this man and these men did. Because 20 years ago, a little girl in a hospital bed had made her father promise, and he was still keeping it. I don't understand how to accept something this large, she said. I have spent my whole life being the one who gives. I do not know how to be on this side of it. You'll learn, Ironside said. You have time. He reached inside his jacket and unfolded a large sheet of paper. Architectural drawings, professional and detailed, covering the table when he spread them out. At the top, in clean block letters, Whitmore's Place Community Center, Copper Falls, Arizona. Projected completion 5 months. Clara leaned forward. 4 floors, ground-level vocational training. Welding stations, carpentry, benches, automotive bays, computer labs, everything someone needs to build a trade. Second floor, 20 units of transitional housing, fully furnished, reserved for veterans and families in crisis, rent-free for the first 6 months. Third floor, a medical clinic staffed by volunteer physicians, open to anyone regardless of ability to pay. Fourth floor, after-school programs, GD, preparation, addiction counseling, job placement. At the bottom of the plans in smaller text, named in honor of Clara Whitmore, who stood when standing cost everything. Clara sat back. She looked at the drawings the way you look at something whose full size you cannot take in at once, that requires being absorbed piece by piece. I have 6 months, she said quietly, perhaps less. Then we build it in 5. Ironside leaned forward. Your body is running out of time, but your work is just beginning, and it will keep going. He stopped. Long after you are done carrying it. Mason put his arm around his mother. She leaned into him, just slightly, the way a person leans when they finally, after a very long time, they allow themselves to rest against something solid. "We do it together," Mason said. "Every step. Promise me." "I promise, Ma." Clara pulled the architectural drawings toward her and began to read them properly, the way she read everything that mattered, slowly, completely, with her full attention. Outside, the desert moved through the ordinary business of a late afternoon. The light was shifting toward the warm end of its spectrum, the way Arizona light shifts in the late afternoon, becoming more golden and less white, more like memory and less like fact. Daisy's voice drifted down from the apartment upstairs, narrating something to an imaginary audience, in the complete unself-conscious way of 4-year-olds who have not yet been taught to be embarrassed by the richness of their interior lives. Clara Whitmore read the plans for the building that would bear her name, and for the first time in 3 months, she thought about the future without dread. She thought about it with something that resembled hope. Miriam Caldwell came on a Thursday 3 weeks after the arrest. She drove from Phoenix in a car that needed new tires parked in front of the diner and sat in the car for several minutes before she got out. She was in her early 60s, gray in her hair, a face that had lived through the worst thing a parent can live through and had not been unmarked by it, and had also by some grace not been entirely defined by it. She was holding an envelope. She had been holding it in various senses for 7 years. Mason saw her through the window. He recognized her immediately, the way you recognize someone you have worked very hard not to think about, which means you have thought about them constantly. He stood up from his stool. "Miriam," he started toward the door. "I am so, stop." She held up one hand, not unkindly, with the tiredness of someone who has arrived at the end of a long journey and does not have energy for anything except the specific thing she came to do. "I didn't come for that." She walked past him and went directly to Clara, who had come out from behind the counter. Miriam set the envelope on the nearest table. She looked at Clara for a moment, the look of a woman who has been preparing for a conversation for a long time and is now in it. "I came to apologize," she said, "to both of you, but first to you." She looked at Clara. "You raised a man worth following, and I spent 7 years punishing the wrong person because I needed somewhere to put the worst pain I have ever felt, and your son was the closest available target." She stopped, started again. "Dylan didn't die because of Mason. A drunk driver ran a red light at 60 miles an hour. That is what killed my son. Not Mason, not his judgment or his failure. A drunk driver." She picked up the envelope. She held it out to Mason. "Dylan wrote this 2 weeks before he died. I found it in his jacket pocket after the accident. I have read it more times than I can count. It belongs to you." The paper inside was soft from years of handling. The handwriting was Dylan's, and Mason knew it from years of notes and lists and messages, a handwriting as familiar as a voice. He read it standing in the middle of the diner while Clara stood beside him and Jolene stood near the coffee maker, and nobody said anything. He read it twice. Dylan had written about his father, about growing up learning how to be angry, learning how to break things, learning how to make the people around you smaller so you could feel larger. He had written about what it was like to encounter for the first time a man who showed him that this was not the only way to be. He had written about specific moments of Tuesday night when Mason had driven 40 miles to help him with a bike. He hadn't asked for help with a conversation on a highway outside Phoenix where Mason had said something about what it means to be worth following that Dylan had written down verbatim and had apparently thought about ever since. He had written, "You saved my life, Reaper. Not from a bullet or a crash. You saved me from becoming my father. You saved me from a life of anger and bitterness and the particular kind of loneliness that comes from hurting everyone who gets close. Because of you, I know what brotherhood means. I know what it means to stand for something larger than yourself. Whatever happens, I want you to know that you are the reason I became the kind of man I was becoming. Thank you. I'll make you proud someday. I promise. Your brother Dylan." Mason looked up from the letter. His shoulders were shaking. He was not making any sound. The shaking was the kind that happens when something that has been locked under enormous pressure for a very long time is finally irrevocably released. Miriam put her hand on his arm. "He loved you," she said. "He worshipped you. And what happened to him on that highway was a drunk driver's fault and nobody else's. Not yours, not your judgment, not any failure of yours." She held his arm. "I took 7 years from you because I needed somewhere to put my grief, and you were there. That was wrong. I am sorry." Clara put her hand on Mason's back. He bent forward slightly under the combined weight of it, under the weight of being forgiven by the person whose forgiveness he had believed for 7 years was the one thing he could not have. He breathed. In, out. The breathing of a man who has been underwater for a very long time and has finally broken the surface. Miriam pulled him into an embrace. This woman whose son he had failed to save holding him while he wept, telling him it was all right, that Dylan would want him to be happy, that 7 years was long enough. Clara watched her son begin slowly, painfully, and completely to heal. She thought this moment alone was worth everything. The 6 months that followed were not enough time. They were never going to be enough time. No amount of time is sufficient when measured against the complete end of a person who has been the fixed point of your world. There is no adequate quantity. There is only what you have and what you choose to do with it. Clara Whitmore chose clearly. She chose the diner every morning. She chose the ritual of opening the 3-turn key and the shoulder against the door and the breakers left to right, not because the rituals needed doing, but because they were how she said, "This still matters, Frank. I am still here. The thing we built together is still going." She chose the coffee she had been making for 45 years. The dark roast, the same distributor, the same blend that wheezed at the end of its cycle, the way it had been wheezing for 3 years without failing. She chose the people. Every morning, Mason made her coffee and brought 2 cups to the small table by the east window, and they sat and watched the light come over the desert, the sky going through its morning sequence of black to gray, to that particular shade of orange that exists only in the high desert at dawn. They talked about Frank, about the years when Mason was small, about things Clara had never told anyone because Frank had been the only person she would have told. She told him now. She told him about Frank's first attempt at the diner's breakfast menu, which had been by any objective measure a sincere failure. She told him about Frank's habit of talking to the concrete as he poured it. She told him about the time Frank had cried at their son's kindergarten graduation and then spent 3 days insisting he had not. Mason told her things he had never said aloud, about the years in the gray country, about the specific shape of guilt, how it changes over time, without diminishing how it becomes something you navigate around, rather than something you ever fully leave. About the 3 years the Harleys sat under the tarp while he moved through motels and highways, doing something that was not living and was not the alternative, but was its own hollow country between the two. She listened to all of it without flinching, without performing compassion, with the genuine, complete attention she brought to everything, the attention that had made people feel seen and known in this diner for 45 years. Every afternoon, Daisy arrived from preschool and climbed into Clara's lap with the automatic confidence of a child who has never been given a reason to doubt her welcome and reported on the day in comprehensive detail. August had eaten paste again, which Daisy considered to be a pattern requiring intervention. The classroom goldfish had been behaving suspiciously, and she was monitoring the situation. There was a new girl named Sophie who could do a cartwheel, and Daisy was working on this skill and expected to have it mastered by the end of the month. Clara received all of this information as though it were the most important intelligence available to her. Miriam Caldwell came every Tuesday. She brought flowers and stories about Dylan's stories from before the club. Dylan at 7 trying to teach himself to whistle, Dylan at 14 with his first serious opinion about something larger than himself. Dylan, the summer he learned to drive and drove everywhere, he was not asked to go just because he could. Story by story, the image of Dylan that Mason had been carrying, frozen at the moment of a single terrible night, expanded into the fuller thing Dylan had actually been. A young man with 22 years of a life. A young man who had been becoming something good. Jolene and Mason fell into the rhythm of the diner together. Not as employer and employee, as two people who had both in different ways been saved by the same woman and who were doing with the time remaining what seemed most worth doing, which was making sure the things she had built continued to feed people, continued to be the place where the lights came on every morning and someone made the coffee and the people of Copper Falls had somewhere to come when they needed to feel that the world still contained places where they were known. Whitmore's Place Community Center went up in 5 months. Clara attended the groundbreaking in a chair because standing for more than 10 minutes had become difficult by then, and she wore the expression of someone watching something be built that they will not live to see fully used, which is one of the oldest and most particular kinds of human faith. She lived to see the walls go up. She lived to see the sign installed. She did not live to see the doors open for the first time, but Mason was there with Jolene and Daisy in her best dress, holding a small American flag she had insisted on bringing for reasons she did not explain, and Ironside with his veterans in formation, and the people of Copper Falls in numbers that their official population did not seem to account for. The governor of Arizona attended. She stood at a podium in the morning sun and spoke about courage without making it sound like a speech in the way that people speak when they have been genuinely changed by the thing they are describing. Then she held up a document. Today, I am proud to sign into law the Clara Whitmore Protection Act. The crowd was quiet. This legislation provides legal protection for workers and citizens who stand up to corporate coercion. It mandates investigation of retaliation claims within 48 hours. It establishes criminal penalties for companies that use threats, violence, or intimidation against persons exercising their legal right to refuse commercial transactions. It provides legal immunity for whistleblowers who come forward with evidence of systematic corruption. She paused. It has already been adopted by 11 other states. Legal experts project full national adoption within 3 years. She looked at the crowd at Mason standing in the front row with his son in his arms. All of this because one 79-year-old woman decided she was not afraid. Mason stood in the parking lot and listened to his mother's name attached to a law that would protect people he would never meet, and felt the full weight of what Clara Whitmore had always known and had spent her whole life demonstrating in the small, consistent, daily way that turns out to be the only way that actually works. That one person standing up changes things. That the mathematics of courage are not about probability. That sometimes you stand because standing is the only thing left that means something, and the standing itself becomes the change. Clara Whitmore died at 3:47 in the morning on a Tuesday. Mason was holding her left hand. Jolene was holding her right. Daisy was asleep in the chair by the window, her cheek pressed against her own shoulder. Her breathing slow and even, unaware that the woman she called Grandma Clara had just quietly finished the longest conversation of her life. It was not dramatic. It was quiet. It was the quietest thing Mason had ever been present for, and he had been present for a great many things. Her breathing had been changing for several hours, becoming slower, the pauses between breaths growing longer in the unmistakable way that requires no medical knowledge to read, only presence and attention. They had both known to watch for it, and they had stayed, both of them, awake and present, because she deserved not to be alone in the last hours of her life, and they were the people who were going to make sure of that. Her eyes opened once near the end. They found Mason's face. "I love you, baby." Her voice was the faintest thread of sound, barely there, a voice at the very end of its range. "Live well." "I love you, Ma." She smiled. It was the smile he had known his whole life. The smile she had given him on his first day of school at his graduation, on the morning he told her he was joining the club, and she had looked at him for a long moment and then smiled exactly this way. The smile that said, "I see you completely. I know exactly who you are, and I am proud of you regardless of everything." She closed her eyes. Daisy did not wake up. Mason did not let go of his mother's hand for a long time. The funeral filled the church beyond its capacity. People stood along the walls and in the doorway and on the sidewalk outside, listening through the open windows to a service that Gus Dawson had spent 2 weeks helping to organize, because he was Frank's best friend and because Frank was gone, and this was the closest thing remaining to honoring that friendship. 93 motorcycles lined the route from the church to the cemetery. They parked in 2 rows along the road, and when the hearse passed between them, the riders stood beside their bikes with their hands at their sides, the posture of men standing at attention and honor guard for a woman they had known for 4 days, who had somehow become in those 4 days someone worth standing for. Mason spoke. He stood at the pulpit and looked out at the faces, bikers and veterans and ranchers and truckers and the retired miners who had come every morning for decades, and the young families who had moved through hard times and found something stable in a diner on the east end of Main Street, and he looked for words. "My mother used to say that angels don't always have wings." His voice cracked. He waited. He continued. "Sometimes they wear aprons. Sometimes they ride motorcycles. Sometimes they just show up every morning and turn on the lights and make the coffee and treat every person who comes through the door like they matter." He gripped the sides of the pulpit. "I spent 7 years running from this town, running from my mother, running from myself because I had decided I was not worth staying for. And she never stopped waiting. She never stopped leaving the light on. She never stopped believing that I would find my way back." He stopped. "I am back, Ma. I am finally completely back, and I promise you on everything I am and everything I will try to become, that I will spend whatever time I have trying to be worthy of the way you loved me." He stepped down from the pulpit and sat beside Jolene, who took his hand. Ironside spoke next. He talked about Fallujah. He talked about what it means when someone runs toward the danger instead of away from it, and what kind of person that requires you to be, not in one moment but consistently, as a way of living rather than a single act. He talked about the specific courage of someone who serves other people not as a transaction, but as a vocation, who shows up every morning, not because she has to, but because she has decided that this is what her life is for. One by one others stood. The trucker who had been stopping at Whitmore's diner for 12 years because Clara remembered his name and asked about his daughter and made him feel like a person rather than a route. The rancher whose mortgage Clara had quietly helped him navigate 3 years ago, the details of which he had never told anyone. The woman from the county assessor's office who had brought her mother to the diner every Sunday morning for 20 years because her mother had Alzheimer's, and the only place that still felt familiar to her, the only place where the smell and the light and the sound of someone saying her name correctly still reached her through the phone, was Whitmore's diner. Story after story, face after face. A life measured not in years, but in the people it touched, which turned out to be an enormously better unit of measurement. In the years that followed, Copper Falls changed. Not all at once, not dramatically. In the way that good changes happen gradually and then continuously, one thing building on another, the community center opening its doors and the first family moving into the transitional housing, and the vocational training filling up with people who needed a trade, and the medical clinic staying open on Tuesdays and Thursdays with volunteer doctors, and the after-school program running 5 days a week with more students than anyone had projected. New businesses opened, small ones. A woman who had taken the welding certification through the community center opened a metal workshop. A veteran who had been housed in the transitional program for 4 months got a job at the hardware store, and a year later bought a small house on 3rd Street. A teenager who had been attending the after-school GED program graduated and enrolled at the State University on a scholarship provided by Lily's Legacy Foundation, and called the community center to say so when she got her acceptance letter. Copper Falls was gradually and then continuously becoming something again. Mason and Jolene married on a Saturday evening in November. The diner, after closing tables pushed to the walls, folding chairs arranged in rows by Gus Dawson, who had not been consulted about whether chair arranging was his role and had not required consultation. 300 bikers showed up uninvited. Mason had not called them. Ironside had simply known the way people who show up for things know when there is something to show up for. They filled every chair and sat in every booth and stood along the walls and ate the food and drank the coffee and listened to Gus's toast with the full attention of people who understand that a story told with love deserves a proper audience. Daisy was the flower girl. She scattered petals with the focus of someone who considers this among the most important responsibilities she has ever been given, glancing back periodically to verify the distribution. They named their son Frank. He arrived the following October, 7 pounds, 4 ounces. His mother's eyes and his father's stillness, that specific quality of being entirely present in whatever he was attending to. He slept his first night in a crib that Gus Dawson had built from mesquite wood, salvaged from the foundation of the old storage shed. This was not an accident. Mason had not been able to put it into words and had not tried, but he had held Gus's shoulder for a long moment, and Gus had understood. The Clara Whitmore Protection Act passed in all 50 states 4 years after its signing in Arizona. By then, 11,400 workers protected from corporate retaliation. 47 public officials prosecuted under its provisions. 312 families saved from the specific kind of coercion that had been visited upon a small town in Arizona when one woman refused to sell her diner. Conrad Vale served his federal sentence at a correctional facility in Tucson. He taught a literacy program for other inmates. His lawyers filed for parole at the 15-year mark. Mason, when a reporter asked whether he opposed the parole, was quiet for a moment and then said that his mother had forgiven Vale in the diner before the FBI arrived and that her answer was more relevant to him than his own. Phoenix Crown Development, restructured entirely under new leadership, paid $60 million in restitution to Vale's victims and sponsored 3 Lily's Legacy Foundation community centers as part of a settlement agreement. Sometimes institutions can change. Not often, but sometimes. The annual memorial ride was held the first Saturday after Clara's death anniversary, and it grew. First year, 93 motorcycles, the formation that had ridden into Copper Falls and changed everything. Second year, 140. People who had heard the story and decided that it was worth honoring. Third year, 212. Fifth year, 340. 10th year, 500 bikes from across the country riders who had come from states that had adopted the Clara Whitmore Protection Act and wanted to see where it had started. They rode down Main Street every year, and every year Gus Dawson came out of the hardware store to watch older. Each time, still there, still the man who had helped pour the foundation of the building, this whole story had grown from. The barbershop pole still turned. The old Paramount Theater's marquee had been updated at some point by hands nobody ever identified. To read Clara Whitmore, she refused to break. The town had collectively decided without discussion to leave it. The formation rode to the cemetery. The engines cut simultaneously, all of them, the way they had cut on Main Street 10 years before. 500 people stood in the Arizona afternoon and looked at the third row from the gate, where Frank and Clara lay side by side under headstones that said builder and soldier, and below each of those, added later in smaller letters, loved. 10 years after Clara died, Mason received a call at 6:30 in the morning. He was in the kitchen of the apartment above the diner. Frank was at the table eating cereal with the methodical focus of a 9-year-old who has priorities. Jolene was already downstairs, the sound of the coffee maker cycling through its familiar complaint, drifting up through the floor. Unknown number, he answered. A woman's voice mid-40s. Mr. Whitmore, my name is Angela Marsh. You probably don't remember me. He listened. A Honda Civic on Route 66, 10 miles east of Copper Falls, 10 years ago. A broken timing belt and a 3-year-old with a fever in the back seat and no money for the tow and no membership current and a mother standing at the roadside not knowing what to do next. He remembered. I wanted you to know, Angela said, that I kept the card you gave me and I did what you said. I passed it on. A pause. I want to tell you how many. How many, Mason said. 317 people I've helped directly. Every one of them got a card from me that said pass it on, and I have no way of knowing how many have come from that. But I know that every one of those 317 people knows your mother's name, knows what she stood for, knows what she started. Another pause. I thought you should hear that from someone. I thought you should know it's still going. Mason sat down at the kitchen table across from his son. Frank was looking at him with Clara's eyes, the blue-gray of a November sky, clear and patient and paying full attention. 317, Mason said. Frank nodded with the solemnity of a 9-year-old who understands that the number matters. Mason walked downstairs and unlocked the diner. Key in the lock. 3 rotations. Pushed the door with his shoulder. Breakers left to right. Not because he had to do it this way. Because this was how Clara had done it. Because this was how Frank had taught her, and she had taught him without either of them understanding that she was teaching him through the daily accumulation of witnessed ritual that becomes inheritance. He stood behind the counter. The light came through the east window at its regular angle, the same angle it had come through every morning for 45 years, and it turned the ordinary air of the diner golden for its 20-minute span, the way it always had, the way it would tomorrow. He looked at the photograph behind the sugar jar. Clara at 25. Dark hair, the wild grin standing in front of a Harley in the sunlight. Eyes already looking past the frame of the picture, already aimed at something the camera could not capture. 317 EMI, Mason said, and counting. He poured the first cup of coffee. He walked to the front door and reached up and turned on the light above it. The same light she had turned on every night for 45 years in case. Because you never know who is out on the road in the dark and needs to see a light in a window and understand that somewhere in this direction, someone is awake and the coffee is on and there is a person inside who will ask your name and remember it. The bell above the door chimed at 6:15. A woman 60 or so rode dust on her jacket and the expression of someone who has been driving through the night hoping for exactly this. A place with lights on, a place that looks like it means to be open. Mason poured a cup before she reached the counter. She settled onto the third stool from the left and wrapped her hands around the warmth of it. She looked around the diner, taking it in the way travelers take, in places that have more history than their surfaces suggest, sensing the weight of what has happened here without knowing the specifics. Nice place, she said. Thank you. Mason leaned on the counter. My mother built it. She looked at him. Something in his face or in the way he said it made her ask, is she still around? Mason looked at the photograph behind the sugar jar, at the light above the door burning in the morning, at the diner that was still standing when everything had tried to take it down, at Frank at the kitchen table upstairs eating his cereal with his grandmother's eyes already becoming someone worth following. She never left, he said. He poured a second cup of coffee and set it on the counter beside the first the way his mother had always done, one cup ready before the person asked and another already waiting, because the conversation always called for it. Outside Route 66 stretched east and west to the horizon, the same road it had always been indifferent to the human lives, arranged along its length, carrying people away from things and toward things in its patient, continuous way. The desert held its enormous silence. The sun came up over the rock, and the sage and the red earth, the same sun that had come up over this particular corner of Arizona every morning for longer than anyone alive could remember. The light inside Whitmore's diner burned against it. Small, steady, completely unintimidated. Some lights once lit require a very specific kind of darkness to extinguish. And this town had run out of that kind of darkness. The bell above the door chimed again and again. And the coffee was always ready, and the lights were always on. And for as long as there was someone who remembered what the lights were for, they would stay that way. Because that was what Clara Whitmore had built. Not a diner, a reason to come home.